The gunshot split the evening air, sending dust clouds rising from the parched ground at Killian Hunt's feet. He didn't flinch, never did. The year was 1878, and in Mineral Park, Arizona territory, a man who flinched was often a man who died before sundown. "Your aim's getting worse, Farley," Killian called out, his voice carrying across the street without emotion. His hand hadn't moved an inch toward his holster. "Next time you decide to greet a man, try using words." Farley Maddox stumbled forward, whiskey bottle still clutched in his left hand, while his right fumbled to reload his revolver. "You took what was mine, Hunt. 5 years I spent working that claim." Killian sighed, feeling the weight of the afternoon sun on his shoulders. His dark brown hat cast a shadow over piercing blue eyes that remained fixed on the drunk prospector. The territorial office ruled fair and square. "Your claim expired. You can't stake land you abandoned for 8 months. The crowd that had gathered along the boardwalks of Mineral Park's Main Street began to disperse, disappointed that the expected showdown seemed to be fizzling out. Killian Hunt had that effect trouble that came looking for him, often left unsatisfied. "I'll kill you for this," Farley slurred, his hands shaking too badly now to properly load his weapon. Sheriff Tom Wilson finally emerged from his office, looking thoroughly inconvenienced. "That's enough, Farley. You're spending the night in my jail." As the sheriff led the protesting drunk away, Killian simply adjusted his hat and continued toward the saloon. He needed a whiskey, a hot meal, and a night's sleep before heading back out to the silver mine. He'd legally acquired the one that had finally started producing after 3 months of backbreaking work. The Grand Hotel Saloon was doing brisk business, the piano player hammering out a lively tune while miners, cowboys, and the occasional businessman exchanged stories and currency in equal measure. Killian found a spot at the bar and ordered his usual whiskey. "Neat. Heard about your trouble with Farley," Samuel, the bartender, said while sliding the amber liquid across the polished wood. "Man can't accept when he's lost." Killian didn't respond beyond a curt nod. He'd learned long ago that words were luxuries in a place like this. The less said, the fewer problems a man collected. His reputation had been built on this silence, the brooding miner-turned-rancher who spoke with actions and settled disputes with either his fists or his gun, depending on how the other party approached him. "Got a letter for you," Samuel added, reaching beneath the bar. "Stage brought it in yesterday." Killian took the envelope, noting the fine handwriting with a frown. He had no family to speak of, no friends back east who would bother writing. Opening it revealed a message from a lawyer in San Francisco. His uncle Jacob, a man he'd met exactly twice in his life, had died and left him a substantial ranch property just north of Mineral Park. "Appears you're moving up in the world, Hunt," Samuel observed, catching a glimpse of the letter's contents. "From miner to rancher in one day." "Appears so," Killian murmured, folding the paper and tucking it into his vest pocket. The timing couldn't have been better. The silver mine was yielding enough to hire proper help, and now he had land to build something permanent. Not that permanence had ever interested Killian Hunt. At 32, he'd spent his adult life drifting from one opportunity to the next, never forming attachments, never letting his guard down. The war had taught him that less than trust was a luxury, and vulnerability was death. The years after bounty hunting across the New Mexico and Arizona territories had only reinforced it. After finishing his meal, Killian booked a room upstairs rather than making the ride back to his modest cabin near the mine. Tomorrow would bring enough challenges. Tonight he needed rest. The room was simple but clean: a bed, a washstand, and a chair beneath a window overlooking the main street. Killian removed his gun belt but placed the Colt within easy reach of the pillow. He pulled off his boots and stretched out on the bed, still fully clothed except for his hat, which he placed over his face. Sleep came as it always did for Killian Hunt, shallow and alert, ready to wake at the slightest disturbance. Dawn arrived with a gentle knock at his door. Killian was instantly awake, gun in hand before his feet hit the floor. "Who is it?" he called, voice steady. "Rebecca from the front desk, Mr. Hunt. There's a lady here insisting on speaking with you. Says it's about the Broken Spur property." Killian frowned. The Broken Spur must be his uncle's ranch. "Tell her I'll be down in 15 minutes. After washing up and making himself presentable, Killian descended the staircase to find a woman waiting in the hotel lobby. She stood with perfect posture, wearing a traveling dress of deep blue that suggested Eastern money. Her honey-blonde hair was pinned beneath a modest hat, and intelligent hazel eyes assessed him as he approached. "Mr. Hunt," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I'm Ruby Kincaid. I worked for your Uncle Jacob as his housekeeper and ranch manager for the past 3 years." Killian shook her hand briefly. "Madam, I understand this must be unexpected news about your inheritance," she continued when it became clear he wouldn't offer more. "I've come to provide whatever information you might need about the property and its operations." "Appreciate it," Killian said, gesturing toward the hotel restaurant. "Have you had breakfast?" Over coffee and a surprisingly decent meal, Ruby Kincaid explained the situation. Jacob Hunt had built the Broken Spur into a profitable operation with nearly 2,000 head of cattle, good water rights, and 15 ranch hands currently wondering what would happen to their employment. "Your uncle spoke of you occasionally," Ruby said, studying him with those perceptive eyes. "He admired your independence, though he wished you'd written more often." "Barely knew the man," Killian replied, uncomfortable with the personal turn of conversation. "Met him twice when I was younger. Don't know why he'd leave me anything." "You're his only living relative," Ruby stated simply. "And he was proud of what you accomplished on your own terms. He kept newspaper clippings about your work as a bounty hunter." Killian's jaw tightened. That was a different life. "Of course," Ruby said, smoothly changing course. "What matters now is that the Broken Spur needs direction. Spring roundup begins in 3 weeks. The cattle buyer from Kansas City will arrive shortly after. Decisions need to be made." "You seem to have managed fine without me," Killian observed, watching her closely. There was something unusual about this woman, a self-possession rare in these parts. "Why not continue?" Ruby placed her coffee cup down carefully. "That wouldn't be appropriate, Mr. Hunt. While your uncle was alive, my position as a female ranch manager was already raising eyebrows. With you as the new owner, speculation would be unkind." Killian understood. A single woman living on property owned by a single man would damage her reputation beyond repair in these parts. "I'll ride out today," he decided. "See this place for myself." "I have a buggy outside," Ruby offered. "I can take you there and introduce you to the staff." The journey to the Broken Spur took just over an hour, during which Ruby provided a detailed accounting of the ranch's finances, the condition of the herd, and the challenges they faced with water rights during particularly dry years. Killian found himself impressed by her knowledge and business sense qualities he hadn't expected in a woman who couldn't be more than 25 years old. The ranch itself surpassed his expectations. The main house was substantial, 2 stories of solid construction with a wide veranda wrapped around 3 sides. Outbuildings included a bunkhouse, barn, smithy, and cookhouse. Fields of alfalfa stretched behind the corral, and cattle dotted the hillsides in the distance. "Your uncle built this from nothing," Ruby said as they approached. 15 years of hard work. "And now it's mine," Killian mused, feeling strangely uncomfortable with the windfall. He'd never taken anything he hadn't earned through sweat or blood. "Mr. Keller, the foreman, has kept everything running since your uncle's passing," Ruby continued as they pulled up to the hitching post. "He's a good man. Loyal." The next few hours passed in a blur of introductions and information. The ranch hands sized him up with cautious respect, clearly wondering if their new boss would maintain or destroy what Jacob Hunt had built. Killian asked pointed questions, inspected ledgers, and toured the property's key areas, all while Ruby Kincaid remained by his side, filling in details and explaining the ranch's operations with remarkable precision. By late afternoon, Killian had made his decision. "I'll be moving in tomorrow," he told Ruby as she prepared to leave. "The mine's producing well enough that I can hire a capable foreman to oversee it. This place." He looked around at the sprawling ranch. "This needs my attention." Ruby nodded, something like relief crossing her features. "I'll help with the transition in any way I can. I've prepared all the necessary paperwork and accounts in the office." "You're leaving?" Killian asked, surprised to find himself disappointed by the prospect. "As I mentioned, it would be improper for me to continue living here," she explained. "I've secured a position as a schoolteacher in town. The previous teacher is returning east to care for her ailing mother." "Seems a waste of your talents," Killian remarked. Ruby smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "I trained as a teacher before circumstances brought me to your uncle's employ. I'm simply returning to my intended profession." Killian found himself studying her more carefully. "How does a schoolteacher become a ranch manager?" "Necessity," she answered, a shadow crossing her face. "When one's plans collapse, one adapts." Before he could inquire further, she continued briskly, "I'll return tomorrow to help you settle in and explain the account books in greater detail." After she departed, Killian spent the evening walking the property alone, thinking about the unexpected turn his life had taken. By nightfall, he'd claimed his uncle's bedroom, now his, and stared at the ceiling, processing the day's events. For the first time in years, Killian Hunt fell asleep without his gun beneath his pillow. The following weeks established a routine. Killian immersed himself in learning the cattle business, working alongside his men from dawn until dusk. Ruby Kincaid visited 3 times weekly, ostensibly to ensure a smooth transition but increasingly to engage in conversations that ranged from ranch management to literature to politics. Killian found himself looking forward to these visits, though he maintained his characteristic reserve. Ruby, he discovered, had an uncanny ability to draw him out. She asked thoughtful questions and listened to his terse answers with genuine interest. Gradually, his responses lengthened. She neither pushed for confidences nor seemed intimidated by his reputation. It was refreshing. One evening, as they reviewed the books in the study, Killian finally asked the question that had been bothering him. "Why did my uncle hire you? A young woman with no ranching experience." Ruby placed her pencil down carefully. "Your uncle found me in rather desperate circumstances in Prescott. I had been traveling west with my fiancée to start a new life in California. He abandoned me after taking what little money I had." Her voice remained steady, though Killian noticed her fingers tightening around the pencil. "I was attempting to secure employment at a hotel when your uncle overheard. He offered me a position as housekeeper with fair wages. When he discovered I was educated and skilled with numbers, he gradually entrusted me with more responsibility." Killian nodded, understanding better now. "He gave you a chance." "He saved my life," Ruby corrected gently. "And my reputation. Not many would have offered respectable employment to a woman in my position." "Seems he was a better man than I knew," Killian admitted. Ruby studied him for a moment. "You're more like him than you realize." The spring roundup arrived, bringing 18-hour workdays and the organized chaos of branding, castrating, and tallying the herd. Killian worked alongside his men, earning their respect through shared labor and fair treatment. He discovered he had a natural aptitude for the business, making decisions that improved efficiency and profitability. Ruby continued her visits, though less frequently as her teaching duties consumed more of her time. Killian found himself watching the road on the days she typically arrived, an unfamiliar anticipation building inside him. One evening, after particularly grueling work separating cattle for the upcoming drive, Killian returned to the main house to find Ruby waiting on the porch, a concerned expression on her face. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, removing his hat as he climbed the steps. "Your foreman at the silver mine rode in an hour ago," she explained. "There's been trouble. Claim jumpers tried to take over the operation. Your men drove them off, but they're expecting the group to return with reinforcements." Killian's expression hardened. "I need to ride out there. Mr. Keller has already organized 6 of your best men to accompany you," Ruby said, her practical nature evident even in crisis. "They're preparing now. I've had cook pack provisions." Killian nodded, impressed despite his concern. "Thank you. Be careful," Ruby added, her voice softening slightly. "These men sound desperate." Something shifted between them in that moment, a brief, unspoken acknowledgement that her concern went beyond business interests. Killian merely nodded again before turning to prepare for the ride. The situation at the mine proved even more serious than reported. The claim jumpers were a notorious gang from Nevada who had been working their way through Arizona territory, using violence and intimidation to seize profitable operations from legitimate owners. It took 3 days of strategic planning and a decisive confrontation before Killian and his men, with assistance from the territorial marshal, drove the gang out permanently. 2 of Killian's miners suffered injuries, and Killian himself took a bullet that grazed his left arm. Upon returning to the broken spur, Killian was surprised to find Ruby waiting despite the late hour. She took one look at his bandaged arm and the exhaustion etched on his face and immediately led him inside, instructing the ranch hand to stable his horse. "You should have had the doctor look at that," she admonished, examining his roughly bandaged wound in the study. "Had more important matters to attend to," Killian replied, wincing slightly as she unwrapped the soiled bandage. "Such as?" she challenged, opening the medical kit she'd already prepared. "Securing the mine, making sure my men were taken care of, getting back here to check on operations." Ruby cleaned his wound with gentle efficiency, her touch professional yet somehow intimate. "The ranch has survived your absence, Mr. Hunt. Your health, however, might not survive your stubbornness." The corner of Killian's mouth twitched the closest he came to smiling these days. "Survived worse than this, Miss Kincaid." "I don't doubt it," she murmured, applying a fresh bandage. "But perhaps you don't always need to test your limits." Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. Killian found himself studying the flecks of green in her hazel eyes, the small freckle near her temple, the wisps of blonde hair that had escaped her practical bun during the long day. He cleared his throat and looked away. "I appreciate your assistance." Ruby stepped back, her professional demeanor returning. "You should rest. The cattle buyer arrives tomorrow, and you'll want your wits about you for negotiations." After she left, Killian poured himself a whiskey and stood by the window, watching her buggy disappear down the road toward town. He felt off balance, unsettled in a way that had nothing to do with his injury or the recent conflict. The cattle sale went exceptionally well. The buyer from Kansas City offered top dollar for the Broken Spurs prime stock, impressed by the quality and condition of the herd. The successful transaction meant financial security for the ranch and bonuses for all the hands who had worked tirelessly during Roundup. To celebrate, Killian hosted a gathering at the ranch, a barbecue with music, dancing, and enough whiskey to ensure the bunkhouse would be quiet well into the following morning. He invited the townspeople who had connections to the ranch, including Ruby. She arrived wearing a dress of deep green that complemented her coloring and revealed that beneath her practical work attire was a figure of surprising grace. Killian found himself watching her throughout the evening as she conversed easily with the ranch hands' wives and helped serve food. "You ought to ask her to dance," Frank Keller, the foreman, said as he joined Killian by the bonfire. "Been watching her all night like a cougar eyeing a deer." Killian shot him a warning glance. "We have a professional relationship." Frank chuckled. "Sure you do, boss. That's why she rode out here at midnight when you came back wounded, looking like she hadn't slept since you left." Before Killian could respond, the fiddler struck up a lively tune, and several couples moved into the cleared space before the cookhouse to dance. Without conscious decision, Killian found himself crossing to where Ruby stood. "Miss Kincaid," he said formally, "would you care to dance?" Surprise and something else flickered across her face. "I would, Mr. Hunt. Thank you." They moved into the circle of dancers, Killian placing one hand at her waist while taking her right hand in his left. The music swept them into motion, and he was surprised to discover that dancing came back to him naturally, despite years of avoiding such social activities. "You dance very well," Ruby observed. Her cheeks flushed from the exertion and the evening's warmth. "My mother insisted I learn," Killian admitted, the personal information slipping out unplanned. "Before the war, before everything changed." Ruby's expression softened. "The war changed many things for many people." "You're too young to remember it well," Killian noted. "I was a child," she agreed. "But I remember my father leaving, and I remember when the telegram came instead of him." Her voice remained steady, but Killian felt the slight tension in her body as she spoke. The music shifted to a slower tempo, and couples around them drew closer together. Killian hesitated, then adjusted his hold, maintaining a respectful distance while allowing the dance to continue. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "About your father." Ruby met his gaze, her expression open and unguarded in a way that made something twist in his chest. "Thank you. And I'm sorry for whatever the war took from you, Mr. Hunt." "Killian," he corrected softly. "I think after all these weeks you might call me Killian." Her smile illuminated her entire face. "Then you must call me Ruby." They danced until the music ended, and then Killian escorted her to get refreshments. For the remainder of the evening, he found himself seeking her company repeatedly, their conversations flowing more easily than ever before. When it came time for her to leave, he insisted on driving her back to town himself, despite the protests of his foreman that the boss shouldn't be acting as a buggy driver. The night was clear, a blanket of stars illuminating the desert landscape as they traveled the road to Mineral Park. Ruby sat beside him, close enough that he could smell the light floral scent of her perfume. "Your uncle would be proud," she said after they had ridden in comfortable silence for several minutes, "of what you've accomplished with the ranch in such a short time." "Had a good foundation to build on," Killian replied. "And excellent guidance." Ruby laughed softly. "Are you actually giving me a compliment, Mr. Hunt? I should mark this day on my calendar." "Killian," he reminded her. "And yes, it appears I am." When they reached the small house she rented near the schoolhouse, Killian helped her down from the buggy, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. He walked her to the door, suddenly awkward in a way he hadn't been since youth. "Thank you for the lovely evening," Ruby said, turning to face him on her small porch. "Thank you for your help these past weeks," he replied, feeling the inadequacy of the words. "The ranch wouldn't be thriving without your knowledge." Ruby studied him in the moonlight, her expression thoughtful. "You would have managed. You're a remarkably capable man, Killian Hunt." Something in the way she said his name made his pulse quicken. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. "Good night, Ruby," he finally said, stepping back before he did something impulsive. "Good night, Killian." As he drove back to the ranch, Killian found himself replaying their conversations, the feel of her in his arms during their dance, the way the moonlight had illuminated her features on the porch. It was unsettling, this preoccupation with a woman. He had spent years ensuring that no one and nothing could affect his equilibrium. The summer brought scorching heat and the constant challenge of keeping cattle watered in the Arizona desert. Killian threw himself into the work, riding out with his men daily to check water holes and move herds to better grazing grounds. The physical labor helped distract him from thoughts of Ruby, though he found himself looking forward to her weekly visits to review the books with increasing anticipation. Their relationship remained professional on the surface, but undercurrents of something deeper began to develop. Conversations lingered longer. Shared glances held more meaning. Occasionally, their hands would brush while reviewing documents, sending an unexpected jolt through Killian's usually steady composure. One blazing afternoon in August, disaster struck. A wildfire, sparked by lightning in the distant hills, began sweeping toward the ranch's northern pastures where nearly 500 head of cattle grazed. Killian organized the entire ranch staff into firefighting brigades, working desperately to create fire breaks and move the terrified cattle to safety. Ruby arrived in the midst of the chaos, having spotted the smoke from town while visiting a student's family. Without hesitation, she hitched up her skirts and joined the bucket line, working alongside everyone else for hours as they battled the relentless flames. By nightfall, they had saved most of the herd and prevented the fire from reaching the ranch buildings, though several hundred acres of grazing land had been destroyed. Exhausted, smoke-stained, and disheveled, the ranch hands gathered at the cookhouse for a late meal before collapsing into bed. Killian found Ruby at the well, attempting to wash the soot from her face and hands. Her usually neat hair hung in disarray around her shoulders, and her dress was ruined with smoke and sweat stains. To his eyes, she had never looked more beautiful. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said, approaching with a clean towel he'd retrieved from the house. "It was dangerous." Ruby accepted the towel gratefully. "Everyone was needed. I couldn't simply ride away." "You could have been hurt," Killian insisted, his voice rougher than intended. She looked up at him, firelight from the distant embers reflecting in her eyes. "So could you. Yet here we both stand." The tension that had been building between them for weeks suddenly crystallized in that moment. Killian stepped closer, one hand rising to brush a smudge of soot from her cheek. "Ruby," he began, uncertain what he wanted to say but knowing he needed to say something. "It's late," she interrupted softly. "I should return to town." "Stay," he said, the word emerging before he could consider it fully. "It's not safe to travel the road alone at night, especially with the fire still burning in places." Ruby hesitated, clearly weighing propriety against practicality. "The guest room?" she finally asked. "Of course," Killian assured her quickly. "I'll have Mrs. Peterson prepare it." The cook's wife, who helped with housekeeping, would ensure everything remained proper. That night, lying in his bed, Killian was acutely aware of Ruby's presence down the hall. The house felt different with her under its roof, warmer somehow, despite the summer heat. He dozed fitfully, images of the fire mingling with dreams of Ruby until he wasn't sure what was memory and what was imagination. Morning arrived with the realization that something fundamental had shifted. When Killian entered the kitchen to find Ruby helping Mrs. Peterson prepare breakfast, her hair neatly braided and wearing a borrowed dress that was slightly too large, he felt a surge of emotion he couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't until later, as they rode out together to survey the fire damage, that he recognized it for what it was, a sense of rightness, of completion he hadn't experienced since before the war had shattered his youth and hardened him into the man he'd become. "We'll need to reseed these sections before the autumn rains," Ruby was saying, gesturing to the blackened landscape. "Your uncle kept records of which native grasses establish fastest after fire. I believe the documents are in the study." Killian watched her, this remarkable woman who could transition seamlessly from schoolteacher to firefighter to ranch consultant without losing her composure. "How did I manage before you came along?" he asked, only half joking. Ruby turned to him, surprised by the personal nature of the question. "You managed just fine, I'm sure. You're not a man who needs rescuing, Killian Hunt." "Maybe not," he conceded. "But I'm beginning to think I needed something I didn't know was missing." Color rose in her cheeks, but she held his gaze steadily. "And what might that be?" The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Killian opened his mouth to respond when a shout from the distance interrupted them. One of the ranch hands was galloping toward them, urgency evident in his posture. "Boss!" the young cowboy called as he approached. "Rustlers hit the east pasture last night. Took at least 50 head. The personal conversation was immediately set aside as they raced back to the ranch. Within an hour, Killian had organized a pursuit party, instructing Ruby to return to town where she would be safe. She protested but eventually agreed when he pointed out that someone needed to alert the sheriff in case the rustlers headed toward Mineral Park. The pursuit lasted 3 days, through rugged terrain and scorching heat. The rustlers, a notorious gang that had been plaguing ranches throughout the territory, fought back when cornered, resulting in a fierce gun battle that left 2 of them dead and one of Killian's men seriously wounded. When Killian finally returned to the Broken Spur, he was exhausted, dust-covered, and troubled by the violence that had been necessary to recover his cattle. He had killed one of the rustlers himself, a clean shot when the man had drawn on him, but a death nonetheless. It brought back memories of the war and his bounty hunting days that he'd been trying to leave behind. Ruby was waiting at the ranch, having heard about the confrontation from riders who had returned earlier with the recovered cattle. She took one look at his haggard face and silently led him into the house, away from the curious eyes of the ranch hands. In the privacy of the study, she poured him a whiskey and waited while he drank it, respecting his need for silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with fatigue and emotion. "Had to kill a man today. Thought I was done with that part of my life." Ruby moved to stand before him, her expression compassionate but not pitying. "You protected your property and your men. There's no shame in that." "There's no pride in it either," he countered. "Just necessity." She reached out, hesitating only briefly before placing her hand on his arm. "That's what sets you apart, Killian. You don't glorify violence. You don't seek it out. You simply do what must be done." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up to her face. "Why are you here, Ruby? You should be teaching your students, not comforting a gunman." "School's dismissed for the day," she replied with a small smile. "And you're not just a gunman. You're a rancher, an employer, a community member." She paused, her voice softening. "And someone I've come to care about deeply." The admission hung in the air between them. Killian searched her face, looking for uncertainty or regret, but found only open honesty in her expression. "I'm not an easy man to care for," he warned. "I've noticed," she replied, the hint of a smile playing at her lips. "Fortunately, I'm not easily discouraged." Something broke loose inside him, then a wall he'd maintained for so long, he'd forgotten it was there. Without conscious thought, he drew her to him, one hand cupping her face as he lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. When she responded by stepping closer, her hands coming to rest against his chest, it deepened into something more certain, an affirmation of the connection that had been building between them for months. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Killian rested his forehead against hers. "I should apologize," he murmured. "Please don't," Ruby replied, her eyes searching his. "Unless you regret it." "No," he said firmly. "That's one thing I could never regret." The following weeks brought a gradual transformation in their relationship. Ruby continued her teaching duties in town but spent weekends at the Broken Spur, ostensibly to help with the bookkeeping but increasingly to simply be with Killian. They were careful to maintain propriety. She stayed in the guest room with Mrs. Peterson as chaperone, but the ranch hands exchanged knowing glances as their boss's demeanor subtly shifted. The hard edges that had defined Killian Hunt for so long began to soften, though his core strength remained undiminished. He smiled more readily, listened more attentively to his men's concerns, and occasionally even joined in when someone struck up music in the evenings. Ruby, too, blossomed in the relationship, her natural confidence and intelligence finding full expression as Killian encouraged her to maintain her involvement in the ranch's business decisions. Together, they planned improvements to the property, discussed breeding strategies for strengthening the herd, and mapped out expansion possibilities for the coming year. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and the promise of winter rains, Killian found himself considering a future he had never imagined possible. The idea of permanence, of building a life with someone, no longer filled him with the restless urge to move on that had driven him for so many years. One crisp October evening, as they sat on the veranda watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and purple, Killian finally gave voice to the thoughts that had been occupying his mind. "My parents had a good marriage," he said quietly. "Before the fever took them both in '62. They respected each other, worked as partners. I always figured that kind of relationship wasn't meant for me." Ruby turned to look at him, her expression curious but patient, allowing him space to continue at his own pace. "After they died, I enlisted. Saw things in the war that changed me, made me harder. Came west afterward because it seemed a place where a man could exist without needing to connect with others." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Bounty hunting suited that mindset. No attachments, no vulnerabilities. "And now?" Ruby asked softly. Killian met her gaze directly. "Now I find myself wanting things I never thought I'd want again. A home, a future, someone to share both with." Ruby's eyes glistened in the fading light. "Are you asking me something, Killian Hunt?" He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "Rode into Phoenix last week. Wanted to find something worthy of you." Opening the box revealed a ring with a modest diamond flanked by small sapphires. "It's not grand," he apologized, "but it's yours if you want it, along with everything else I have to offer." Ruby's hand trembled slightly as she touched the ring. "Are you certain? I know how much you value your independence. Some things are worth surrendering for," he said simply. "Will you marry me, Ruby Kincaid?" "Yes," she whispered, tears finally spilling over. "Yes, I will." The wedding took place in December, a small ceremony in the Mineral Park Church followed by a celebration at the Broken Spur that brought together the entire community. The ranch house, decorated with evergreens and winter blooms, welcomed friends and neighbors as Killian and Ruby began their life together officially. That night, after the guests had departed and the house had quieted, Killian led his bride to the master bedroom, now their bedroom. Ruby, radiant in her wedding gown, looked around at the space he had renovated in preparation for their marriage, noting the new furniture and feminine touches he had added to make it truly theirs. "It's perfect," she said, turning to face him. "All of it." "Not quite perfect yet," he replied, drawing her into his arms. "But it will be." The transition from solitary rancher to married man came more naturally to Killian than he had expected. Having Ruby beside him each morning and night, sharing meals and conversations, working together to improve the ranch, it felt right in a way nothing had for decades. There were adjustments, of course. Learning to consider another person in every decision. Finding compromises when their opinions differed. Opening himself to the vulnerability that came with loving someone completely. Ruby proved to be both a passionate lover and a steadfast partner, her strength complementing his in ways that continually surprised him. She maintained her teaching position through the winter, riding to town 3 days a week while overseeing the ranch accounts and correspondence on the remaining days. By spring, their partnership had developed a comfortable rhythm. The ranch flourished under their joint management, with profits increasing as they implemented innovative breeding programs and more efficient operations. The silver mine, now managed by a capable foreman, provided additional income that allowed for further improvements to the property. One evening in April, as they prepared for bed, Ruby approached Killian with an expression that combined excitement and nervousness. "I have something to tell you," she began, taking his hands in hers. Killian raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "I visited Dr. Thompson in town today," she said, a smile beginning to bloom across her face. "It seems the Broken Spur will have a new resident come November." For a moment, Killian stared at her uncomprehendingly. Then understanding dawned, and his normally composed expression transformed with wonder. "A baby? You're certain?" Ruby nodded, laughing as he swept her into his arms and spun her around the room. "Quite certain. The doctor says I'm in excellent health, and everything appears normal." That night, Killian held Ruby close as she drifted to sleep, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. The idea of fatherhood, of creating a family when he'd spent so long believing he would always be alone, filled him with a mixture of elation and trepidation. But as he watched his wife's peaceful sleeping face, he felt a surging determination to be worthy of this new responsibility. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months, though Killian insisted Ruby reduce her teaching schedule as her condition became more apparent. She agreed reluctantly, channeling her energy instead into preparations for the baby and continued involvement in ranch operations from the comfort of the house. Killian found himself becoming increasingly protective, much to Ruby's mingled amusement and frustration. He hired additional help for the household, insisted on accompanying her whenever she needed to travel to town, and even had a special cushioned chair built to make her more comfortable during the hot summer days. "You're hovering again," Ruby observed one afternoon as he adjusted the windows to create a better cross breeze in the study where she was working. "Just taking care of what matters most to me," he replied unapologetically. Ruby rose from her desk, placing a hand on her now prominent belly as she crossed to him. "I love you for it," she said, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "But I promise, women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I'm quite capable." "I know you are," Killian assured her, placing his hand over hers. "It's me I'm not so sure about. Never imagined myself as anyone's father." Ruby's expression softened. "You'll be wonderful. You already protect and provide for everyone who depends on you. This will simply be one more person under your care, our care." As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and the annual cattle sales, Ruby's time grew near. Killian arranged for a midwife to stay at the ranch during the final weeks of the pregnancy and ensured that a fast rider was always ready to fetch the doctor from town if needed. The baby, however, had timing of its own. On a stormy October night, with the wind howling around the ranch house and the doctor unable to travel the muddy roads from town, Ruby went into labor. The midwife took charge confidently, directing Killian to heat water and prepare clean linens while she attended to Ruby. Hours passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation as Killian alternated between pacing the hallway and sitting beside Ruby, holding her hand through increasingly difficult contractions. Her strength amazed him, the determination in her eyes even as pain racked her body, the gentle reassurances she offered him despite her own discomfort. Shortly before dawn, as the storm finally began to abate, a new cry joined the subsiding wind. Killian, who had faced gunfights without flinching, found himself trembling as the midwife placed a small, wrapped bundle in his arms. "You have a son, Mr. Hunt," the woman announced with a tired smile. strong and healthy, just like his mama. Killian looked down at the tiny, red-faced infant, overwhelmed by a surge of emotion unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The baby's eyes were squeezed shut, his small fists waving in protest at the brightness and cold of the world outside the womb. "Jacob," Ruby said softly from the bed, where she rested against fresh pillows. "After your uncle who brought us together. If you agree." Killian nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He carefully brought the baby to Ruby, placing him in her waiting arms before sitting beside them on the edge of the bed. "Jacob Daniel Hunt," Ruby continued, looking up at Killian. "Daniel for my father." "It's perfect," Killian finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. "He's perfect. You're perfect." Ruby smiled, exhaustion and joy mingling in her expression. "Not perfect, but ours." The following months brought new challenges as they adjusted to parenthood. Sleepless nights, the constant demands of an infant, the rearrangement of routines to accommodate their son's needs all tested their resilience and adaptability. Yet Killian discovered reserves of patience he hadn't known he possessed. The same focus and determination that had made him a successful rancher now translated into devoted fatherhood. He took pride in learning to change diapers, in walking the floor with a fussy baby to give Ruby rest, in the small daily triumphs of caring for their son. Ruby watched this transformation with loving amazement, seeing sides of her husband emerge that he perhaps hadn't known existed. The hardened former bounty hunter who could make tough decisions without hesitation now sang softly to an infant, his expression softening whenever small fingers wrapped around his much larger ones. One morning in early spring, Ruby awoke before dawn to find Killian's side of the bed empty. Concerned, she rose and went to check on the baby, only to find the nursery empty as well. A moment of panic seized her before she heard soft murmuring from the study downstairs. Following the sound, she paused in the doorway, her heart filling at the sight before her. Killian sat in the large leather chair by the window, little Jacob sleeping peacefully against his chest. Dawn light was just beginning to filter through the curtains, illuminating them in a golden glow. What arrested Ruby's attention, however, was Killian's expression. He was smiling, not the restrained half-smile he sometimes offered in company, but a full, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious features. And he was completely unaware of it. His attention focused on the sleeping infant as he murmured stories about the ranch and plans for teaching him to ride someday. Ruby must have made some small sound, for Killian looked up suddenly, the smile still lingering on his face as he saw her. "He was fussing," Killian explained quietly. "Didn't want to wake you." Ruby crossed the room and perched on the arm of the chair, one hand coming to rest on her husband's shoulder, while the other gently stroked their son's dark hair. "You were smiling," she observed softly. "In your sleep, I've never seen you truly smile, but just now with Jacob." Killian looked down at their son, then back up at Ruby, the smile returning. "Guess I had something to smile about." Ruby leaned down to kiss him gently. "I love you, Killian Hunt. I love the man you were when we met, and I love even more the man you're becoming." "Never thought I'd have this," Killian admitted, his free arms circling her waist to draw her closer. "A family, a home that's more than just a place to sleep, a future worth building." "And now," Ruby prompted. "Now I can't imagine any other life," he replied simply. "You and Jacob, you're everything." As the years passed, the Broken Spur prospered, as did the Hunt family. A daughter, Elizabeth, joined them 2 years after Jacob's birth, followed by another son, William, 3 years later. The ranch expanded, eventually becoming one of the largest and most successful operations in the territory. Killian Hunt, once known primarily for his deadly accuracy with a gun and his unapproachable demeanor, gradually became respected instead for his fair business practices, his commitment to the growing community around Mineral Park, and his devotion to his family. Ruby continued to balance motherhood with involvement in ranch operations and community affairs, eventually helping to establish a proper school building in town and serving on its board. Her partnership with Killian, both in business and in life, became a model that influenced other marriages in the changing Western territories. Jacob grew into a thoughtful young man who combined his father's strength with his mother's intelligence. Elizabeth inherited Ruby's organizational skills and Killian's determination, while William showed early signs of the same quiet leadership that had made his father successful. On the 20th anniversary of their marriage, Killian surprised Ruby with a trip to San Francisco, something she had always wanted to experience. They left the ranch in the capable hands of Jacob, now a young man of 19, and enjoyed 2 weeks of luxury and culture in the thriving coastal city. On their final night there, as they stood on the balcony of their hotel room overlooking the bay, Killian wrapped his arms around Ruby from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said quietly. Ruby turned slightly to see his face. "For what?" "For catching me off guard all those years ago," he replied. "For seeing something in me worth believing in when all I showed the world was a hard exterior." Ruby smiled, the years having added character to her beauty without diminishing it. "I saw a good man who had forgotten how to show it." "I'm glad you remembered." "You reminded me," Killian corrected. "Every day since, you've reminded me." Later that night, as Ruby slept peacefully beside him, Killian watched the moonlight play across her features, still marveling at the turn his life had taken. The former bounty hunter who had never allowed himself to dream of happiness now measured his wealth not in cattle or silver, but in the love of the woman beside him and the family they had created together. And as he drifted toward sleep, a smile now familiar and unguarded spread across his face, a testament to the heart that had finally found its home.